You're welcome to our two guests, in fact. Thank you. Let's do that.
Great. Well, it's good to be with you. Filling in for Roger. Sorry if that's a disappointment to you, but anyway, there we are. You're stuck with me. But Alan, it's great to have you.
Thank you very much.
A very warm Yorkshire welcome.
Thank you.
It's not your first time in God's country, is it?
Does the motorway go through Yorkshire?
Oh, dearie
That's
me.
all I've seen of it, really.
Oh, okay, right,
So,
okay. Yeah. Well,
yeah.
It's wonderful. You've got to spend some time here.
Yeah.
Anyway, Alan, it's great to have you. So let's begin at the beginning, find out a little bit about your background.
Yeah.
I know your parents are from Scotland.
Yes.
You live in Bath.
Yeah.
But you didn't grow up in either, did you?
No. So, first of all, thank you for having me. It is a pleasure to be in Yorkshire. It's my first proper visit. So my mum and dad are from Scotland. My dad's from Glasgow. My mum's from Hamilton, just nearby. And they grew up there. And then in their early 20s, I guess, they went off to Bible college and were looking to go and serve overseas as missionaries to tell people about Jesus. And so in 1970, they headed off to what at the time was known as East Pakistan, which you will know as Bangladesh. 1970 just so happened to be the year that they had their War of Independence. So if you know the geography of the area, so you had East Pakistan, West Pakistan, and India bang in the middle. So about 1,000 miles separating the two, which really wasn't very clever of the British when they split up the country. But East Pakistan had a lot of the natural resources. West Pakistan was the seat of power. They fell out. They went to war. And so my parents' kind of early months in Bangladesh was the civil war, which was quite tricky. I was born when they came home after that on a brief visit. So born in Scotland, but then went back out when I was a few months old, and grew up in Bangladesh. We were initially living in the capital city of Dhaka, which is a large city, and then we moved out to a place called Kushtia, which was about a day's journey from Dhaka, and it was still a pretty big place for a town. I mean, I guess it was over 100,000 people, but there was one other Western family and then us, and we were the only two my brother and I were the only two sort of little kids, so everyone in the town kind of knew us. You could wander around wherever you wanted, and everyone knew the two little white boys, Colin and Alan, and so it was a really good, carefree life growing up there as kids, climbing the trees and swimming in the rivers, and it's just a lovely place to grow up. And Bengali people are such warm people, really lovely people, very cultured, very poetic. So yeah, we had a great time growing up there.
But you weren't schooled there, were you? You had to travel off to school.
Well, initially my mum homeschooled us. We didn't have any schools locally that would prepare us for eventually coming back to the UK. And for most expats or missionaries, at some point, probably the plan is they're going to come back. And so you've got to work out how do you prepare your kids to come back. And so my mum homeschooled us initially. There were no local schools that she could send us to. And then it just became a bit too much for her, really, because we had this little, we called it our schoolroom, but it overlooked our back garden and then this massive field where all of our friends, we had a couple of friends who lived across the other side of the field, and every now and then you just hear them shouting, "Colin, Alan." And we're sitting there trying to do our maths and everything, and right, Mum, we're off. So she realized we needed proper education, and they decided either we'd need to come back to the UK at that point, or we'd need to explore other options. And so we heard of this school called Hebron School, which is a Christian boarding school in South India, in a beautiful spot, 8,000 feet up in the hills. And it's surrounded by tea gardens, and I was saying to someone earlier over our kind of breakfast, it was a place that during the time of the British Raj, they used to use that as their summer retreat. So when it got really hot and sticky on the plains, everyone would disappear up into the hills, and the Maharaja of Mysore kept his summer palace up there. So it was a lovely kind of spot that was still, when I was there, still very popular as a kind of tourist destination for Indians. And we went there to school, went there, saw the school, liked it, and decided we would like to go there. But of course, that was a long journey. It was sort of a day's journey from Kushtia to Dhaka. And then from Dhaka, we'd fly to Kolkata. From Kolkata, we'd get the train for 2 days down the east coast of India to Madras, which is now known as Chennai. From Chennai, we get another train to Coimbatore. From there, another train to Methi. And from there, we get one of the old steam trains that climbs 8,000 feet up into the hills. And if any of you have seen the BBC programs on the steam trains of India, great series of programs if you haven't seen them, but our school was in one of those places.
How old were you? How old were you, Alan, when you went to boarding school?
I was 7.
That's quite young.
It was pretty young, and my brother Colin was 9. And boarding school for some of my friends had a really rough time at boarding school. We actually had a really positive experience of it. I mean, I still remember the moment I had to say goodbye to my parents that first time. That was really hard. But my mum always used to come up early for midterm holidays and stay on later. So kind of the longest period I went without seeing them was probably 6 weeks.
Now, some might assume people were brought up in a home of faith, Christian home, would automatically become Christians, and especially if you're the children of missionaries. But that's not always the case. I know I've met a number of Mish kids who really found it very hard and kind of rebelled, kicked against it.
Yeah.
How was it for you in terms of your own personal experience of Christianity?
So as a friend of mine often likes to say, God doesn't have any grandchildren. We're not born into it because our parents are believers. We're not necessarily believers. And as a young child, I did what I imagine most children do. You watch your parents and you look for signs of integrity in their lives, that the things that they say and the things that they do match up. We did quiet times together as family. We'd read the Bible together. Church for me was quite difficult in Bangladesh because there were very few Christians where we were. And so church was done in Bengali, a language that I was just getting used to, but I didn't have the theological language or anything like that. So it was quite dry for me, and I found that quite tough. So our kind of family times were the most important times. And as I watched my parents, it was very clear that the things that they believed, that they said they believed, married up with their lifestyle. And so as we kind of talked and as we read the Bible together, I became convinced that Jesus really was God himself. I mean, the concept of God in Asia is most people believe in God, so that wasn't an alien thing, and it wasn't something I'd ever really doubted. But the question of whether Jesus is God, that I became as convinced of as I could be as a 7-year-old, in that what I read in the Bible about Jesus, very much he stood out as someone who's very different to everyone else. And so as a 7-year-old, I remember praying with my mum one day and recognizing I needed God to forgive me for my sins. And that was probably the extent of my faith at the time. I knew I'd done things that were wrong. I knew it needed forgiving. And so I prayed and asked God to forgive me. And that was the summer before I went off to boarding school that I became a Christian.
Some might say, wow, that's very young at 7. You're impressionable, influenced by your parents, etc. Has it remained real for you?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I think, as I said, as a 7-year-old, you can only have a very limited understanding of anything. So I accepted what I'd been taught and what I understood of the Bible to be true. As I then progressed through life, I obviously read the Bible more myself, and I was at a Christian boarding school where going to church was compulsory. We had prayer meetings, we had Bible studies, and I kind of went along to all of these things. And in some ways, that was a great thing, being in a Christian boarding school. In other ways, it meant that you didn't have to think through your faith so much because it wasn't being challenged. So it could be very easy to simply go along to things and accept it because most of the people there did as well. But I did have a genuine faith and a faith that was growing. But at the same time, it could be quite easy to sort of go through the motions without really without really proving God's faithfulness for yourself.
And you were going to have to
Yeah.
prove that, weren't you, in a very real way. So we come to the events of the, 1990, I think it was, wasn't it?
1990.
Yeah. I'm looking around the room and I'm thinking, will people remember the Gulf War? I think some here might remember the First World War. I don't want to be rude, but I think most of us here,
really cheeky.
most of us here are old enough to remember all the events of Saddam Hussein and the Gulf War and et cetera, et cetera. But how on earth did you get mixed up in all of that?
So, my brother Colin was one academic year ahead of me, and when he was, he's one academic year ahead of me, two years older than me. When he was 17, he finished his GCSEs at Hebron, and my parents thought, if we're going to bring our family back to the UK at some point, it's probably going to be easier to do it for them to go into A levels than to come back and then go straight off to university. Because you do get a reverse culture shock coming back. I mean, I know I was British, but I hadn't lived here all my life thus far. So when Colin finished his GCSEs, we came back home for the summer. That was 1990, and I was very clear that I wanted to go back to Hebron to finish my final year of GCSEs because all my friends were there, and that was my comfort zone. I knew everything, understood everything. So we spent the summer in the UK and Scotland that year, had a great time, and then it was time to head off back to school. And so I was just going to fly back by myself. Something, we traveled as youngsters by ourselves before. That wasn't uncommon. And so we went to the airport and to leave and say our goodbyes. And I remember, at the airport checking all my luggage and then getting ready to go through security. And as a family, we stopped just to pray together and to, obviously say our goodbyes. And as we did that, we recited what we fondly called our family verse, which was a verse from the Bible that we used to recite whenever we were saying our goodbyes, whenever we were going off to school. And it's from the book of Hebrews, chapter 13, verse 5 and 6. It says, God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. So we can say with confidence that the Lord is my helper, I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? And I remember we recited this verse together, and my dad said, Alan, just remember, God's never going to leave you. He's never going to forsake you. You've got nothing to fear as you go off by yourself and spend this time away from us. God's in complete control. And then we read together from what was one of our sort of favorite psalms in the Bible, Psalm 139. And in Psalm 139, the psalmist poses this sort of rhetorical question to God. And he says, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? And then he answers it. He says, well, if I go up to the heavens, you're there. And if I make my bed in the depths, you're there. And if I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me, and your right hand will hold me fast. And my dad said, Alan, even if you rise on the wings of British Airways, God's with you and you have nothing to fear. There's nowhere that you can go that you'll escape from his presence. And so I had this kind of wonderful encouragement from my parents as I left. We said our goodbyes. I kind of went on through security, and we'd kind of prearranged. This was obviously the days before mobile phones. We'd prearranged that I would go through and I'd pick up a public phone and call them on another phone just to let them know everything was okay. And I got through, and I bumped into one of my school friends from my class, a guy called Josh, and his family were an Indian family. His father had dual American Indian nationality, and they'd been in the States over the summer holidays and were flying back to Hebron as well, and just so happened to be on the same flight as me. So I was able to call my parents and say, look, I've just bumped into Josh and his family. Everything's great. I know people. We're going to be traveling together. And so they were delighted just to know that there was someone kind of looking after me. So I put the phone down. And then we boarded the plane. Our flight was going to Madras, as it used to be, but stopping first of all it was going to Bombay, but stopping first of all in Kuwait for a refueling stop, then India, then on to Kuala Lumpur. And so we left in the early hours of the 1st of August, sorry, late on the 1st of August 1990, arrived in Kuwait in the early hours of the 2nd of August. And as it was a refueling stop, we were allowed to kind of get out and stretch our legs if we wanted to. So I decided to get off the plane. I took my hand luggage with me, and it was a really bizarre moment. I was chatting to someone at breakfast who's a pilot, and he'll know well, but any of you who have traveled in anywhere in the world, you know that big international airports are never completely quiet, even in the early hours of the morning. There's always someone around, and I was wandering around this airport, and except for the odd janitor who was scurrying around, there was nothing else there, no one else there. Every other flight had been diverted, which is an entirely different story, which I won't go into now, but basically, the Iraq had invaded Kuwait before we landed, and every other flight was diverted except for ours. And but we didn't know that at the time, so I was walking around the airport. I came back to the departure lounge, having found nothing open, nothing to do. And just as I was kind of walking towards it, suddenly this massive commotion broke out. People were screaming and shouting and running off the plane, saying, get away from the windows, get away from the windows. And being an inquisitive teenager, I ran towards the windows to see what was going on, and looked out the windows, and you could just see these jets flying over and dropping bombs and massive explosions going off. And very quickly realized this is a serious situation and we need to get away. And so we kind of huddled together in a corner of the airport waiting for the bombing to stop, which eventually it did. And as we waited there, these soldiers came. And I just naturally assumed these were Kuwaiti soldiers because we were in Kuwait. But it transpired that actually these were Iraqi soldiers. And Iraq had invaded just a few hours earlier. I've subsequently kind of read into things a little bit, and the wisdom of the age was that Iraq was probably going to take 3 or 4 days to invade Kuwait and to capture it. As it happened, within a matter of hours, they were in Kuwait City, and so everything happened very quickly. And so we were taken to the airport hotel, and assuming that probably the next morning we would just be put on another flight somewhere and fly on to England or fly on to India. But that wasn't to be the case.
How old were you at the time?
So I was 15.
That's quite young to be in that situation.
Yeah.
How did you feel? Were you excited or scared or mixture of both maybe?
It was a mixture of both. I mean, if you can remember your teenage years, you'll know that there's a sort of certain teenage bravado that you have, that you think you're untouchable. And you look at the world and think everything's fine, and I can, and so there was a sort of a sense of, wow, this is quite exciting, and imagine the stories I'm going to tell my friends when I get back to school. At the same time, I was, this shouldn't be happening. But I mean, genuinely, I thought probably I would be flying on the next day. I thought this is just like something's happened, tomorrow will be fine.
That didn't happen.
And that didn't happen. No. So we were taken to the airport hotel, and again, this must have been the early hours of the morning, and we were assigned some rooms. So I was sharing a room with my friend Josh, and I guess we slept for a few hours, then woke up, looked outside the window, and it was just helicopters flying around, tanks surrounded the hotel with their guns facing in. Helicopters bringing in as I found out later, the elite Republican Guard, and there was gunfire, and it's just a proper war zone. And I think at that point I realized actually this is something more significant than I realized, and we're probably not going to be going home today. Shortly after, we heard gunfire downstairs, and we were called down to the lobby, and an Iraqi officer or general, I don't know who it was, but essentially gathered us all together, and in so many words explained that Iraq had invaded Kuwait and that we weren't going to be able to leave, and but that they'd look after us and we'd be staying in the hotel.
So at that stage, were you still with your friend from
Yes.
school?
So I was still with Joshua and his family, and they were kind of looking out for me, and we'd pray together, and we'd encourage one another, and this carried on for about a week to 10 days.
Were you able to contact your parents?
No. So my parents didn't know. They knew I hadn't arrived in India. They knew our plane had been captured, but they didn't know what had happened to us. So for the entire time I was in Kuwait and later in Iraq, they didn't know if I was alive or if I was dead. And for them it was I would say a more challenging time than it was for me. As any of you who've got kids, you'll know that would just be awful. So we were at this place for about 10 days, and they were feeding us, obviously, from the hotel supplies, and they were feeding the Iraqi army who were around us as well. And I imagine they were doing that at various hotels in Kuwait. But eventually the food was running low, and they called us down to the lobby once again, and they told us they were going to release us. And again, probably I was a bit gullible, but I just assumed that was going to be the case. And what they did then, they split us into two groups. So they said, we want all of the Western, they didn't call us hostages, we want all of the Westerners over this side of the room. So you're kind of French, American, German, British, whatever. And everyone else we want over this side of the room. And so at this point, I got separated from Josh and his family. His dad being American, he was very conscious that being an American was probably a bad thing. Being held hostage, so I think he ripped up his American passport, and they just kind of stayed together as family on the Asian side of it. And we were told that they're going to take the Westerners to the airport first, and then the others would follow. And so I mean, it was a strange thing. I didn't understand why they were doing it, but I still assumed that we were going to get taken to the airport. I'd meet up with Josh and his family, and we would then fly home. What actually happened was a whole bunch of buses came. They had obviously confiscated the passports. They called out our names. We got into these buses, and again, some officer came onto the bus and he explained that given the airport had been bombed, we couldn't take off from that airport, and so they're going to have to take us up to Baghdad and fly us from there. So they put us on a kind of a 6 or 7 hour bus ride up through the desert, through what later became known as a highway of death. If you remember any of the images of the Gulf War and those kind of, that road strewn with demolished tanks and cars and all the rest of it. We went up that road up to Basra in southern Iraq, and then from then on an overnight train to Baghdad. And we're taken to a hotel called the Al Mansour Milia Hotel, which actually was quite a pleasant hotel right on the River Tigris. And we were, this was essentially used as a collecting point really for all of the Western hostages. So there must have been a few hundred of us here, including some military personnel that had been captured. And we were confined largely to the top few floors of the hotel. We were allowed out for about an hour each day for some exercise. Again, pretty well looked after, fed well, no particular issues. I grew up in boarding school food, so everything was a step up from that. And so we were here probably again about 10 days. And I remember we weren't meant to have any radios or anything, but one of the guys in the kind of the group I was hanging around with had a shortwave radio, and we would hear the BBC World Service, and they're saying, well, George Bush Sr. and Margaret Thatcher, they're going to send in their warships, and they're going to bomb Saddam, and they're going to bomb Iraq. And we were like, whoa, we're here, be careful. And so people were beginning to, people were already quite anxious, but the tension was ratcheting up, and people were increasingly thinking that we were going to be there an awful long time.
Alan, you said that you prayed.
Yeah.
And you talked about that verse, that family verse that your parents had given you. What difference having that relationship with God in this, what I guess now is feeling a pretty scary situation, what difference did knowing God make to you there?
Well, those verses were verses that stuck with me all through my time. They were verses I was very familiar with anyway. When I got off the plane and took my hand luggage, in my hand luggage I had my Bible. And I had some Bible notes that I used to read. For those of you who are not familiar, it's just a little commentary on a passage in the Bible. So you read the Bible passage, and the notes just help to explain it a bit. So I was reading my Bible each day. I was praying each day. When I was at this place, the Almanzor Emilia Hotel, my parents, obviously back in the UK at the time, had been contacted by British Airways to say that the British ambassador in Iraq was going to try and visit the hostages. They didn't know who they'd be seeing, which hostages they'd be seeing, but there was a chance that I might be there, and would they like to send a message? And so all the families were sending telegrams, which is the old version of texts, limited message, and so the guy had called up my dad and said, look, we can send a telegram that might get to Alan. We don't know if it will or not. What would you like to say? And my dad said, dear Alan, remember our family verse, and remember there are thousands of people all over the world praying for you. And that was a huge encouragement to me. I did get that message. They didn't know that, but the British ambassador and some of his colleagues came, and I picked up this message, and it was such an encouragement, because yes, I was reading my Bible. Yes, the Lord was helping and sustaining me. Amazingly, I never actually felt afraid. There were times when I did feel a bit lonely, because, as much as people tried to look out for me as a 15-year-old traveling by himself, everyone had their own concerns and their challenges. And the guy I was sharing a room with at the time was someone who was in his probably mid-40s, and he was, I guess he had a much more realistic view of the situation, but he wasn't particularly encouraging in his output. So he'd see me reading my Bible, and I remember him saying, I don't know what you think your God's going to do, but we're going to be here for months, so we may not ever get out. And so there was a real sense of despair amongst a lot of people, but the Lord really kept me, and kept me from despair and kept me from fear, and that was great. Interestingly, even while we were there, Saddam Hussein had organized for a vicar to come and hold a service for us, which was quite incredible. So that was also a precious time.
I was going to ask you about the other hostages, because obviously many of them wouldn't have been Christians. They wouldn't have had a faith.
Yeah.
How did they react? Did you see different reactions, I guess?
Different reactions, and it is really interesting, I think. When you're living out your faith, you're not always conscious that people are watching you, but they are. And jumping forward another couple of weeks, when I ended up being released, one of the ladies who had been part of my group came up to me just before I left and said, I noticed you've been reading your Bible and it's been a real help to you. And asked if I had a spare Bible, which to my shame at the time had become so precious to me. I said no as I was leaving, and never gave it to her. I subsequently spent over a decades in fact, trying to find her. Eventually found her, sent her the Bible that I'd kept with me in Kuwait and Iraq. And but she was an atheist and sent it back.
Now, some of us, I'm sure many of us here will remember that infamous TV stunt that Saddam pulled.
Yeah.
In fact, I was looking at a video of it on YouTube. There's several videos on YouTube, probably aware. I was looking at one of them last night, and I think there's a quick glimpse of you on there. You were in that room, weren't you?
Yeah.
Just tell us a little bit about what happened there.
Okay, well, let me tell you how we got there, because it kind of ties in with it. So we were at this hotel, the Almanzor Emilia Hotel. Again, one day they called us down to the lobby, told us they're going to release us, piled us onto buses, and in my seat, like all the windows were blacked out. You couldn't really see where we were going, but there was a little crack in the tinting, and I could see signs for the airport as we were driving along, and greatly encouraged, thinking they're going to release us. And we were driving along, kept following signs for the airport, and then suddenly we got to this junction, and the airport was signposted that way, and Babylon was signposted this way, and we ended up turning off towards Babylon. And so again, I realized we weren't going to be released, and we were taken to a recently deserted army barracks next to some sort of factory, and kept there just for a couple of days, sleeping on the floor or on couches. People, again, there's just this constant ratcheting up of the tension. They plied people with big multi-packs of cigarettes to try and help calm them down, and Then more buses came. We weren't all being taken in these buses to the same place. Basically, they were spreading us out around Baghdad and the suburbs to use us as a human shield, so to guard the sites that they didn't want the Allies to bomb. And from that place, I was taken on to another final place, where the place you're talking about, which we wondered at the time if it was some sort of chemical factory, because as it so happens, at that time, Saddam did have chemical weapons. He didn't when we invaded, but he did then. And the guards had gas masks, so we kind of wondered. But I remember arriving at that place and having now been there for just over 3 weeks and getting into this room, and I just burst into tears. I guess I'd held it together for 3 weeks, and there was just this sort of release of tension. And I remember as I cried, I prayed, and I was just praying. I said, Lord, you've been with me all this time, and I'm really grateful, but I just really need to know that you're in control of this, because I'm beginning to feel lonely. And then I opened my Bible to read the passage for that day, and the passage I was reading was the story of Daniel in the lion's den. And I had a limited knowledge of the story. As I found out later, Daniel was probably in his 80s when this happened. But what I did know was that Daniel was taken captive as a teenager to Babylon. And here I was, a teenager, taken captive to Babylon. And Daniel had done absolutely nothing wrong. And he'd been thrown into this den of lions to be devoured by the lions. And he prayed to God, and God saved him from the lions. And it was as if God was saying to me in that moment, Alan, just as I was with Daniel thousands of years ago in this very same spot, I'm going to be with you. And I remember reading that and, again, just bursting into tears and really grateful, actually, that God had just spoken to me, not audibly, but he had spoken to me through the Bible as I read it, and just convinced me that, yes, I'm still in control. You don't need to worry. I'm still in this. And I had this, I just had this feeling that I couldn't shift, that within a few days something was going to happen. And it never anything I'd felt before, never something I've felt since. And I remember saying to myself, Alan, God doesn't always work in amazing ways. Don't hold on to this hope that something's going to happen. But 2 days later, I was there washing the few clothes that I had. They'd given us a washing machine to use, and the instructions were in Arabic. It would have been hard enough in English, let alone in Arabic. And trying to work out how to use this thing. And this guy walks in, surrounded by guards. And I had no idea who he was. And as he walked past, I sort of nodded to him and said hello. And one of the guards grabbed me and said, "This is Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq. And he wants to speak to you." So we went into this room, all of us, not just me and him, all of us gathered together. And I was pretty bored out of my head, if I'm honest. So I knew, like I'd heard the name Saddam Hussein, and if I had been a bit more of a switched-on teenager, I'd probably have watched more of the news before I left and been aware of what was going on, that he was amassing, an army of about 100,000 people about to invade, but I didn't, so it's all to my shame. But I was sitting in this room pretty bored as he talked about politics and were you getting your cornflakes and were you, just inane nonsense, really, and blaming George Bush and Margaret Thatcher, and he'd love to have released us, but unfortunately he can't. And
there's in the video, there's a point where he gets a very young boy,
a little guy called Stuart Lockwood,
who looks really scared.
Yeah,
and he's sort of grilling him and questioning him, talking to him.
It is really interesting because so this kid Stuart Lockwood was in our group, and I think really what Saddam Hussein was doing was typical Middle Eastern hospitality. You find the young children and you sit on your knee and you stroke their head, but it was definitely not interpreted that way by his family or by the media. In fact, there were a couple of kids playing under a table, and I remember when I came home and the media were analyzing it and saying, well, actually, they can sense the evil and they're hiding, they're sheltering themselves. Actually, it was just a couple of kids playing.
Oh, right. Okay.
But it was a very strange atmosphere, and for the adults who understood the situation, it was a very tense atmosphere, because of course this man held our lives in his hands, and he had a reputation. I mean, he had murdered tens of thousands of his own people, let alone his war with Iran and all the rest of it. So the guy had history, and but anyway, he talked to us for a while, and at the end of this kind of conversation, he came around to shake our hands and to say goodbye. And as he shook my hand, this lady beside me, who her and her family had kind of kept an eye on me because they had children my age. And so when when we were there, I kind of hung out with them, with the kids. And as Saddam Hussein shook my hand, she said, this lady's name was Pat. She said, Mr. President, this boy, his name's Alan. He's only 15. He's here by himself. His parents don't know if he's alive or if he's dead. Is there anything that you can do for him? And I think they felt a real weight of responsibility for me. And the president sort of paused, and he said something to the interpreter, who looked stunned. And the interpreter turned to me, and he said, the president of Iraq has just asked if you'd like to go home. And so at his command, I became the very first Western hostage to be released from Iraq. I was taken back to the Al Mansur Millet Hotel in Baghdad, where I met up with the British Airways crew who were being held there. And I was then spent a night there, and the following morning, another officer came to pick me up in his car, took me to the airport, and then I was flown. Basically, they put me on a flight to Amman in Jordan, and they basically said, when you arrive. So when I was in the car, this guy gave me an envelope. He said, "This is a gift of $500 from Saddam Hussein, because your luggage was blown up, and here's some money." And so I was really holding on to that tightly. It's the most money I probably ever had. And when I was leaving Baghdad, being flown to Jordan, again I was thinking, well, what do I do when I get to Jordan? Because you're just flying me to somewhere I don't know. And you've told me when I get there, just find someone, tell them you've been released. So again, in this flight, I was praying and saying, Lord, I don't know what I'm going to do when I get there. Please help me. And arrived in Jordan, and the big kind of, I need to remember what these things are called, the big arms that come out to the airport that you walk down. I start walking off the plane. I was the only Westerner on the plane, so I'm quite stand out. I'm walking, looking up, trying to think, okay, who am I going to speak to? And I see these two British Airways guys up ahead. And so I start walking towards them, and as I'm walking towards them, I'm reciting in my head this whole story that I'm going to have to offload on them. And I start walking towards them, they start walking towards me, and I'm just about to launch into this, and they say, "You must be Alan." Oh, yes. And they said, well, we heard news that you were probably being released. When it was first released, they said that a 15-year-old boy called Alex Farney was being released, so the name was wrong. But my parents were quite certain it was me, and the British Airways were quite certain it was me. And they said, we heard you were going to be released. We've spoken to your parents, and they've asked us to take you home. And so that was just wonderful, at last, not to have to worry anymore, and just to be in the safe hands of people who are going to look after me.
And they flew you back to the UK. Were your parents waiting for you at the airport then?
Well, they took me first of all to they had a house in the city in Amman, and with a swimming pool and a change of clothes, and right. I was at that point able to call my parents, and it was a great and a reassuring conversation for my parents, because my dad sort of picked up the phone and said, "Alan, how are you doing?" Really not knowing whether I was going to be mentally scarred, in tears, whatever. I said, "Dad, you're never going to believe this. They've given me a Lacoste shirt." and growing up in Bangladesh, all the clothes we had were knockoffs because we couldn't afford it. So like it was Adidas, not Adidas, and the Nike tick went the wrong way and everything. So the fact that I'd been given this brand new kind of Lacoste polo shirt, and so my dad heard that, thought, right, he's okay. So I was then kind of, I spent a few hours there, and then flown back to London, where I was taken to the VIP lounge and met with my parents. Had a wonderful reunion. Just so lovely to see them again, and for them, for them to know where. I mean, my brother told me after I was released that they were up in Scotland at the time, that they used to go for walks up in the moors, and my parents would say to Colin, "Look, we know that God's in control, but we don't know if Alan's going to come out of this alive, and we have to trust that God knows what he's doing." And so my brother, time's not knowing if I'm going to come back, my parents not knowing if I'm going to come back, and it was a wonderful time just to catch up, and then I was very quickly debriefed by the Defense Ministry and the Foreign Office to see if I knew anything interesting or useful, which I didn't, and then...
What, you knew some useful information?
They wondered if I did know anything.
Oh, I see, but you didn't.
But I didn't.
Oh, okay.
No, I wasn't the the best use in that regard. But then I had to do a load of press conferences and so on. And yeah. So.
And what I must ask you, what did you do with the $500?
So this was quite interesting because I had to the one thing I did tell the Defense Office and the Foreign Ministry, or the other way around, however you say it, I told them that I'd been given this money by Saddam Hussein or by this officer, and they were the only people that I told. And then at the end of this first press conference I did, one of the reporters said to me, "Alan, we understand that you were given this money, $500. What are you going to do with it?" I was thinking, wow, I've got all these plans. And my mum piped up and said, "Actually, we consider this to be blood money, and we're going to give it away to charity." And I was like, no. What a disaster. But and my mum felt terrible about this after. I mean, to them it was just like, how dare he think he can pay us off? But over the many years subsequent to that, they really didn't have much money. I didn't know, but they kept drip feeding until they paid off that $500 to me.
And the other hostages were released shortly after, were they? Or?
So the women and children were kept for another few weeks. And at the time, again, everyone was told they were going to be released. And so everyone was expecting to go home together. And then suddenly it was changed to just the women and children. And that was a very tough thing because, wives had to decide if they were going to leave their husbands or stay with them. So that was very difficult. But the women and children largely were released 3 weeks later. And the men were kept for a few months.
How do you feel about your captors? Because it would be easy, wouldn't it, to feel bitterness towards them?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously Saddam Hussein was eventually overthrown and executed.
Yeah.
How do you feel about those people?
I don't feel any animosity towards them at all. I mean, it was a very strange thing actually when Saddam was captured and executed. Because I didn't know him from Adam when I saw him, and sure he'd done a lot of things he deserved to be judged and tried, but actually he was a sinner. He needed God's grace and forgiveness, we're all very quick to judge people sometimes, aren't we? But I need God's forgiveness just as much as he does, and so it was sorrowful in some ways to see what happened. And towards the guards, again, I had no animosity. I mean, they were doing what they were doing under duress. They had very little choice. And they didn't, by and large, they didn't mistreat us too badly. And so, yeah, there was...
What would be your wish for those guys?
To come to know Jesus. I mean, there's nothing more important. They're just ordinary people going about their lives, and unless someone tells them about Jesus, they're never going to know that they need him. So
One last question, Alan. You said that there were moments when it was very tense, and your parents obviously didn't know. Well, as your brother said, we didn't know if we were going to see you again.
Yeah.
And the reality is that could have happened.
Yeah.
It's happened to others in a similar situation.
Yeah.
Alan, if it had happened to you, if it had come to that, do you know where you would have gone?
Yeah. So absolutely. I mean, the day I became a Christian when I was 7 years old was the most important day of my life. I probably didn't realize it at the time, but that was the moment that life changed in an eternal sense that I didn't know at the time. In that whatever happened to me at that moment or any moment subsequent to that, I was going to be safe with Jesus. And so I knew, and I know now, and I've known subsequently through difficult times and health issues and so on, that actually ultimately my life is in God's hands. And of course none of us want to go through pain and struggle and suffering and so on, but ultimately it's all going to be good in the end because I know Jesus. And so I've got nothing to fear. And
you're certain of heaven?
Absolutely certain of heaven.
And what if somebody said that's a bit arrogant? What would you say?
What can you say to that? I mean, all we need to do is to look at the consistency of Jesus' life. look at all the evidence. Take the time to look at the evidence. Examine it yourself. Please, whatever you do, don't just dismiss it offhand, because a lot of people do that, or they were brought up in some sort of loosely Christian education and think at one point they've actually looked at it when they've never really investigated it properly. If Jesus is who he says he is, and if he did what he says he did, then it's absolutely life-changing. And I'm convinced that he is who he says he is, and therefore I know I'll go to be with him when I die.
Yeah, wonderful. Alan, thanks ever so much for sharing. Let's show our appreciation. Brilliant. Well, it's just falls to me then, just for a few minutes to round off. The word freedom is a very potent word, isn't it? It resonates with us. There's something deep in the human psyche that wants to be free, and the importance of being free. And the opposite, of course, the idea of being a slave or a prisoner or a hostage is, something that really would strike, I guess, sort of fear and loathing into all of us. Jesus once said this. He said, "If the Son shall set you free, you'll be free indeed." And the kind of freedom that Jesus was talking about was not physical freedom, because actually the people that he was speaking to were actually enslaved by the Romans. They'd been conquered. They were occupied. No, the kind of freedom that Jesus was speaking of was a much deeper, far more significant, far more important freedom that actually all of us need to know in our lives, wherever we are, wherever we live, whatever our circumstances are. And the wonderful truth is, it's a freedom that we can know. Every single one of us can know. Of course, there's a lot of people who try and find freedom in different ways, aren't there? Some people think that freedom is all about being able to do anything you want to do. You know, I can be what I want to be. I can do. No one can tell me what to do. But actually, the reality of that is it's not freedom at all. You actually become a slave. In fact, Jesus just has said before he makes that statement, he who sins is a slave to sin. We think, don't we, if I'm boss, if I'm master, if I'm king of my own life, if I can make my own decisions and do what I want to do, well, that'll be the answer. And the reality is, the very opposite is true. Interesting that Jim Morrison, who was the lead singer of the 60s band, again, some of you might remember that, he once said this, I want the freedom to try everything. I want to be free, personal freedom, do what I want to do. And you'll know that he died at the age of 27 after abusing drugs and alcohol. Jimi Hendrix, who was one of his contemporaries, another 60s musician, said this, do I seem free? If I'm free, it's because I'm always running. And that is the reality, actually, for a lot of people, isn't it? Their freedom really is just running away from the truth. Running away from reality, running away from the truth about themselves. Because the truth about us is that actually we're not free on our own. We can never be free because there is this problem within that Jesus talks about. Slavery to sin. Every single one of us is like that. I know I'm on a platform a couple of feet higher than you, but honestly, we're all on a level, right? Every single one of us. None of us can point the finger at anyone else. But it's God who says, we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That doesn't mean to say we're as bad as we possibly could be. It just means that none of us are as good as we should be. And that's true, isn't it? If I said we were to go to New York today and visit the Empire State Building, and we were all going to get in the lift, and you were all going to select a floor, and the floor you selected represented how good or bad you thought you were. The viewing platform at the top, really good. Basement at the bottom, really bad. I wonder which floor you'd select. I doubt many of us would choose the basement, would we? I mean, Hitler's down there. He's down there with the paedophiles and rapists and murderers and maybe Saddam Hussein. And maybe you would say, I'm not going to go to the viewing platform. I mean, really, really that good? No, I'd be in the middle somewhere. Yeah? Somewhere average, somewhere in the middle, you know? If I was to ask you the question, where do you think God's standard of goodness would be? I wonder what you'd say. Which floor? Shall I tell you it's none of the floors? God's standard of goodness would be the moon. And do you know what that means? It means every single one of us falls 1,000,000 miles short of God's standard of perfection. See, we're good at comparing ourselves with others, aren't we? And say, I'm not as bad as him. Okay, I'm not as good as her. But God says we are all guilty. We are all sinners, right? And the Bible says that is a reality. And the reality is you can never escape that sin on your own. You ever tried to live a perfect week? A perfect day? A perfect hour? Can you do it? You ever looked in the mirror and you thought, I wish I could be different? Why did I do that? Why do we find ourselves hurting the people we love the most? Why is that? The truth is, you cannot escape this problem of sin on your own. It's got us all. But listen, the wonderful truth is Jesus came to set us free. A number of years ago, I used to live, and finish with this, I used to live in a block of flats in London. It's quite a few years ago. I was a student. And it was a pretty run-down block of flats. And the lifts were always breaking down. And one morning I woke up to a very familiar sound, the emergency bell from the lifts. So I went down and to the lifts, and sure enough, there was a problem. So I rang the caretaker who managed the whole campus, and I said, look, there's someone stuck in the lift. Again, they've broken down. Can you send someone to get them out? He said, what a coincidence. He said, the lift engineers are on site doing a job. I'll send them straight down to get these people out. Some of you have guessed already. Well, I went off for breakfast and came back about an hour later, and these people were still ringing the bell. They were still stuck in the lift. So I called up the lift shaft as best I could to say, look, you know, help's on its way. The lift engineers are on site. And this little embarrassed voice echoed back down the lift shaft to me. You can guess, can't you? We are the lift engineers. And apparently, they'd gone up one lift that was working, they thought, to fix the other. It had broken down mid-floor, and they were trapped. And there they were. And they had to call for some more engineers to come from HQ to get these engineers out. And they were very, very embarrassed and red-faced. There they were in their overalls, big badge, I'm a lift technician, big, bag of tools, and, all the rest. But they were hopelessly trapped because they said to me afterwards, you can't get out from the inside. Somebody's got to rescue from the outside. And I thought, wow, what an illustration of where we all are. We cannot get out from the inside. There's 4 invisible walls that surround us, the walls of our sin. Hey, and listen, that lift shaft is 80, 70, 60 years long. And the lift's going down, and one day it's going to reach the bottom. And what happens then? But here's the good news. Someone came from the outside in, outside this world. Someone who was never a slave to sin. Jesus said, if the Son shall set you free. What does he mean? He's the Son of God. And therefore he's sinless, he's perfect. And he's the only one who can free us. No other human being can set you free from sin. I can't. No religious guru, no religious leader. They've got their own sin to deal with, right? Only Jesus, the sinless Son of God, can set you free. And he did something amazing to set you free. He willingly became a prisoner. He willingly allowed the Romans to take him. He willingly allowed them to nail him to a cross. And he died on that cross to buy our freedom so that we could be set free. It was an incredible price that he paid. But on the cross, he took our sin and our guilt on himself. And the sinless Son of God was punished in our place so that we could be set free from that guilt, so that we could be forgiven. And he rose again from the dead and conquered death so that we can be free from the fear of death too. so that we can know, as Alan was saying, where we're going, absolutely certain and confident of heaven. Can I ask you this morning as I finish, are you free? Do you want to be free? Free from guilt. No longer weighed down by that guilty conscience. Free from the power of sin. Jesus giving you a new power to be different, to live a different life. Free from the fear of death. Knowing where you're going when your moment comes. This morning, Jesus offers you that freedom. And he's only a prayer away. Let me just say as I close, there's a little booklet here written by Roger Carswell, would you believe it? Well, Roger's not here in person, but in print he is. So it's an opportunity to read something that Roger has written, Trust in Christ. It's a really helpful little booklet that explains how you can find that freedom in Jesus. There's even a prayer in the back that you could pray. And if you prayed that prayer with all your heart, I honestly believe God would answer it. Today, he'd set you free. Thank you.